Thank you. Allow me to stand on existing protocol and wish all of us a good morning. I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, please let me know. Thank you. All right. So my name is Mercy Obonyo, or Messi Obonyo, as Glenn would call me. And I work for an international institution called Turning Tides Facility, which is a giving facility, and our focus is supporting tenure, security, and rights recognition of small-scale fishers, indigenous peoples, and local communities. And so this is a very important conversation for us, and you will shortly see my panel and understand why, because we really strongly believe that there is a link that needs to be appreciated when we speak about tenure and climate. And I'm going to go right into that in a short while. But it is on that auspice, and thanks to Al for really making sure that we were here to connect with all of you. And for you to also hear some of the lived experiences, some of the stories from different parts of Africa on this link, and together really think about, joint action to ensure that we are centering communities, and the communities here are the groups that I have mentioned when we speak about climate investments or climate processes. I have a very robust panel with me. I'll introduce them shortly. But before I do, allow me to just really do a little framing for a few minutes and share why we really think this kind of conversation is important and is needed in a space like this. Ladies and gentlemen, you'd agree with me that the vulnerability and the marginalization that continues to be faced by small-scale fishers, fish workers, fish processors, indigenous peoples, and local communities is unsurmountable. We cannot even, speak about it enough. And as we continue to think through climate action, continue to think through different investments, targeting the issue around climate, we have to really bear in mind that if we leave these groups behind, then we might be missing a very critical component and critical agents in this conversation. If you look at Africa, just Africa in context, and this is not exhaustive, but just few examples, and really putting this in your minds, and I know you may already know about this. You know that over 680 million people in Africa depend on aquatic resources for their survival, for their livelihood, for their well-being. It really is the fabric of who they are. 680 million people. What is puzzling me is when you look at this and look at the continuous systemic and structural marginalization, rights violations, and tenure insecurity to these groups, you cannot even equalize that. Indigenous peoples are a very critical actor group in this country, here and in the globe and in this region of Africa, are a group that are critical to our well-being as Africa, but more often than not, they are not being meaningfully engaged when we speak about climate processes. And so what I keep wondering about is, what if we centered communities better? What if we allowed communities to lead in coming up with actions to deal with the climate crisis? What if we really appreciated the link that connects tenure to climate and really understand that tenure and tenure security is a critical prerequisite to ensure that we are moving closer and closer to addressing the climate issue? The pattern that we are seeing is these very critical partners and actors are being involved most times in later stages when we speak about climate processes. And so it's almost like an afterthought. So do we have any ideas and thoughts about how we could actually begin to reinforce the agency of these important groups in this continent? I know that tenure means different things to different people, and before I invite the panel, I think it would be good to just share our definition as turning tides, because it doesn't deviate much from what the legal provisions have, but we just really embody the humanness of tenure also to that description. So what do we mean when we say tenure at Turning Tides? So for us, Tenure is often generally understood more about ownership. And so at Turning Tides, we really want to move away from that narrow, legalistic view of tenure where we only speak about ownership, but also think about the broader understanding of tenure where we are accounting for societies, for cultures, for relationships, for responsibilities. And this is the responsibilities of these groups with the lands, with the coastal and ocean resources or aquatic resources, with their natural resources, and how they govern them as well. For us, tenure also encompasses diverse rights. And what is more important to us is power. One of our models is really to think about how to share power and how to center the power and decision making of local communities, indigenous peoples, and small-scale fishers when we speak about tenure, and in this case, when we speak about climate processes. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring a robust panel to us, and we are not going to try to tell you anything you don't know. But what we want to do with this panel is to have them share stories that you can relate with, numbers, experiences that really bring to light the link between tenure and the climate action, but also tenure and human rights. And we hope that through that, we are able to think through together on how to better center communities, how to really reinforce the agency of these important groups as we continue to explore the link between tenure and climate change. So ladies and gentlemen, at that point, allow me to introduce to you the panel that we have today. Just 1 minute. So I'll start with Honorable Joseph Ole Simel. And we have the honor as Turning Tides to have him sit in our steering committee, really strongly representing the voices of the indigenous peoples. Honorable Joseph Simel is the executive director of the Manyoito Pastoralist Integrated Development Organization. He is also the Africa Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change convener. Many other ways that he supports is he is an observer with the World Bank. He sits in many steering committees to discuss issues of rights, tenure, and natural resource governance. And we are so honored today that he will be helping us to better bring to light that link. You're welcome, Honorable Simel. A round of applause for him. We have Mr. Gabriel Muswali. Welcome, sir, who is representing AfriFishNet, and he will shortly tell us about AfriFishNet. But over and above that, Gabriel is a strategy and a programs advisor to the East African Platform for Non-State Actors in Fisheries and Aquaculture and the Pan-African Platform for Non-State Actors in Fisheries and Aquaculture, AfriFishNet. Gabriel's docket coordinates advocacy and capacity building, work on aquatic food systems in the Eastern African region, and also well within the African continent. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Gabriel. A round of applause for him. We have Mr. Glenn Casper. Please join us. Glenn is a prominent Namibian youth leader that I've had a chance to listen to in many of these forums, and he will blow your mind away when he shares about the Top Nar community and how their tenure rights have continued to be impacted and just what really they're asking for and their call to action. But over and above that, just as an indigenous group native, Glenn also then sits in many spaces where climate, oceans, tenure, and issues related to that are discussed and even policies formulated. Glenn has contributed as a co-researcher with the One Ocean Hub. On that, he was focusing on ocean governance and environmental sustainability. He is deeply involved with preserving their culture, and you will see that. He is deeply passionate about cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, and very soon we will hear from him what the lived experiences have been for the Top Nar community. We have Miss Norma, and Norma, I'll introduce you shortly. So Norma, please join me. So Norma is our friend and colleague who works for natural justice. one of the service providers in the continent that really then urgently respond to communities when their tenure rights have been, infringed on and when they are facing rights violations. So Norma here is Norma Sango. We call her Norma, but the full name is Norma Sango Masie. She is a Zimbabwean lawyer who works with natural justice. She has a specialty in research, and she focuses on environmental justice, climate litigation, and human rights. So Norma has co-authored many research pieces on SLAPs, on carbon markets, and climate litigation. And we know that her contribution to the various advisory opinions in the continent really then helped to center and spotlight the issues of the communities. So Norma, we are very delighted to have you this morning. So without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give the floor back to our panelists. And as I had mentioned, it's really just storytelling. So we will start with Honorable Simel. And please, I know that we have talked about this, but feel free, one, to reiterate the elements around indigenous peoples and this space and what you see as some of the opportunities for us to really consider when we speak about tenure and climate, because we're also speaking about climate action, but also recommendations. There are several partners in the room that also are funders for work on ocean and climate. So a warm welcome to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Mercy, and thank you, participants. Thank you for organizing this very important dialogue. So thank you, Mercy, and thank you, participants, for organizing this very important dialogue between very diverse range of participants. I think the question is, you are talking about security of tenure, but particularly in line with marine resources. I'm wondering how many people in the room really depend on fishing as a livelihood options. How many people in the room? 2. So it's not just an opportunity, Mercy, as you put it, but what are the barriers? What are the challenges? It's not just about opportunities, but what are some of the barriers that continue to exclude and marginalize those particularly people whose voices must be heard? Security of tenure is very traditional. Security of tenure never started today, never started yesterday. They've been part and parcel of humanity. It has to do with the identity and spirituality of the people. It has to do with the local environment. And I think, to me, I see within the climate space, and as the global society continue to address the crisis, security of tenure is so central, very fundamental. But we must done in a way, first by recognizing those people who depend on that resource. We must begin talking about climate resilience by recognizing what community have been doing before the crisis. Remember, this community contribute nothing to the crisis. They are only the victim of the crisis, a crisis that are started by others, and therefore they become victim of the crisis that they have never contributed in one way or another. Coming from the African continent, while we may think about opportunities, but let not shy away from the reality on the ground, where these people have been completely excluded from any resilient program, any policy intervention, that basically they have been created to become spectators. What do we need to do? Because I have to leave here at around 10. We need to decolonize our attitude. We need to decolonize our mentality. We need to decolonize our methodology. We need to decolonize the policy environment. And that's the only way we can talk about climate resilience, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, when we decolonize our attitude and everything. Why am I saying this? Because I see climate, the drivers of the climate intervention are coming from the old mentality of colonization. Very difficult for me to believe at the moment that the solutions are driven by the people on the ground. Look at the ocean, for example. Who is benefiting from the ocean? And is it sustainable when you when you do in a way that the commercial industry is doing, excluding completely the local fisher communities from this particular resource? Today, the fishing are done by multinational companies with chemical nets, completely destroying the environment. Do the local people have a say? No, they don't. They don't. Because the government on the ground is not pro-people. And these are some of the challenges that we must address. We are in the African Climate Summit too. Do we see fishing community in this space? No. And therefore, the decisions are going to be made here are likely to affect them negatively. Because so long as you are not on the table where decisions are made, anything favoring you will be rare. And that's what we need to change. We need to change the power balance so that these people can speak for themselves. These people can be on the table at the national level, at the county level, if I'm coming from Kenya. So, for example, if you are coming from Kenya, and some of you know Lamu, some of you know Kwale, Kilifi, do those communities sit with the government advisory team? Will these people have a possibility to sit down with the county government or the national government? If they don't, then there's really nothing which is going to be fair for them. So finally, solidarity, unity of purpose at the national, at the regional, at the global is going to be fundamental. We must change the narrative, and the global community must understand and appreciate the role of traditional knowledge, the role of those communities in conserving the environment, in coming with solutions that address the impact of climate change. In other words, what these communities are doing, they are contributing so much in decarbonizing the climate, the environment, through their action. So for me, it's about a major shift, the way we are approaching things, and recognizing the people on the ground as having the knowledge, know their problem, and they know their solution, and therefore they need to be facilitated in order to address what they see as a problem. I think what the world have done over the years through this kind of colonization is somebody to sit in Washington, you know a problem somewhere in Kilimanjaro, and he has a solution for that problem. But he had never been in Kilimanjaro area. So how can somebody sitting in Washington know the solution in Madagascar, and you have never been in Madagascar? I think we need to change that mentality. We need to recognize the people on the ground, know the environment, know the spiritual relationship, and know what's the solution for that particular environment. Thank you.
All right, apologies for that. So Glenn, I was saying, just to tie in neatly to what Honorable Simel is saying, I know that you're very passionate about traditional knowledge, heritage, youth involvement, but also community-led action when we speak about climate. And I know that you have done some research on tenure, and it would be good for you to just share the Topnar experience with us this morning.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. As it was introduced, I'm Glenn Casper from the Native Topnar Traditional Authority, which is a community which was the first inhabitants of the coastal line known as the Namibian coastal line. In those years, it was known as the Grootnamakoland. So our ancestors used to live from the ocean and dependent on the ocean very much. And when we talk about the ocean of indigenous people, we talk about the land also, part of the land. So my community is known as the Hurinin people, which is known as the sea people. Our community had very connection, spiritual connection with these oceans. And our community has been relocated from these coastal ancestral parts, which is a very sad thing that is happening in contemporary Namibia. Although these issues were part and parcel of the colonial regime, we still see that the colonial regime laws are still passed down in the independent Namibia. So for me, I saw a need for preservation of this culture. Although we do not have this access anymore to our ancestral land right, it was important to look at three pillars of our traditional community, which was identity, belonging, and pride. And that is what we must, as African continent, must see, because Africa is not only it's not only about the resources or about the roads or about the infrastructure that is right now. It's also built on the wisdom of ancestral people, of indigenous people. And this is why I saw the need of preserving my cultural heritage. And if we see today, when I did my research for the Topner traditional community, it was a very sad thing to see, because this knowledge only exists in elders' minds, and it is not being practiced today. You know, there are sea poems, there are poems that elders used to say to the sea. There were spiritual things that our elders used to do with the ocean. They know how to relate with the ocean. And it was, for me, very sad that to see that a culture, a tradition that has so much history is being excluded in many spaces. Today, it's very difficult for a traditional leader to make decisions on a land because the community is now living in a park. And it's sad to see that as a traditional leader, the only thing that you have to say is on your people and not on the land. This is the policies that is implemented by our own people. We are talking about the colonial regime. I don't blame them. It was done. We are now independent. But let's see how these terminologies are changing. First, when the Germans came to our land, they called them native reserves. That was what they called them. Then the South African came in. They called them homelands. In the independent Namibia, we are calling them communal lands. It's just a change of terminologies, but it's the same thing that is happening to our indigenous communities. So we are talking about climate resilience today, but climate resilience goes hand in hand with tenure, with ownership. So we must first recognize that concept of ownership, land ownership, for the indigenous people. Our countries, African countries, are member states of United Nations. They have adopted the UNDRIP. They know who are the indigenous people. They know how they will identify these people. And it was for me very sad yesterday when there was a discussion yesterday about indigenous people, and my good friend was talking about these indigenous people. The president of PAP, of the Pan-African Parliament, denies indigenous people. And for me, that was very sad, because I wanted to grab that mic from him, because they are the ones who are supposed to represent us on that level of AU. And they adopted these laws themselves. They should start to read the laws. So it was for me very painful to see that indigenous rights are still being excluded and being marginalized in the contemporary Namibia, not only in Namibia, but all over Africa. So for me, it's very important that we as indigenous people, as Africans, we must unite and come back to the drawing table. And that is for indigenous peoples to be recognized on any level. Because we are talking about even climate financing. My mayor yesterday had a discussion, and he stressed the need that when climate financing comes into his municipal boundaries, it doesn't reach to his indigenous people. Why not? Because it's not in his municipal boundaries. And it was very sad for him, because he said we can talk about climate change and everything, but when we don't talk about these indigenous people, when we don't talk about the traditional knowledge, then we are not going anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I'd like... Apologies for the technical interruptions. Bear with us, please. We are trying to make do with what we have. So I was really just reiterating a few things there that Glenn has mentioned, and also feeding off of what Honorable Simel spoke about. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, we have to agree that climate change and the responses to climate change, including the processes that we are taking and in their intricacies, have to really take to heart the meaningful involvement of local communities, indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers, and fish workers. The other thing that Glenn mentions, which I resonate with and I think would be good to reiterate at this point of the conversation, is that we have to now appreciate that if we continue to overlook and inadvertently continue to maybe ignore, allow me to use that word, or deliberately just not pay intentional attention to how communities, small-scale fishers, and coastal and shoreline indigenous peoples engage with the environment, the immense knowledge and heritage they have, how they have systems in place that they were using to manage their tenure, then we are really not going to get there. This has to be centered in this conversation, and I really just wanted to, echo that. Norma, listening to the conversations in the room, and knowing that natural justice is a strong advocate for the community, I want to put you on the spot. Not really, I don't think I had told you this before, but there is some immense work that you're doing in West Africa, for example. And I think very, tenure related issues, and feel free to share the other experiences. I just really wanted you to share, one, your perspectives as natural justice, and how you see the role of lawyers in this conversation when we speak about tenure and climate, and also just understanding the ambiguities in this climate conversation. And do communities always get it? How can we better center communities in this conversation?
Thank you so much, Mercy. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Noma and I'm from Natural Justice, and we're so grateful to be part of this conversation, which is really, really important because we work with a number of coastal communities as well as fishing communities all across the African continent. And as I have been listening to some of the previous speakers here, what has really been on my mind is the issue of rights. I'm a lawyer in my background, and so a lot of the terms that I'm going to talk about will be legal, technical terms. And I think tenure speaks to rights issues. It's about positive rights and negative rights. When we talk about positive rights, we talk about rights that allow you to be able to do certain things, right? So who has certain rights to be able to control, to manage, and to use our oceans, our lakes, our rivers? And then there are also negative rights. Negative rights basically are rights that basically impose on you certain duties. So who has certain duties to refrain from harming these natural resources that, as we've heard from previous speakers, are so valuable to us here on the continent? And I think that's the background and context within which we're having these discussions. I think if you ask coastal communities and different fishing communities, they'll definitely tell you that secure tenure basically is very fundamental, because it not only guarantees you access, but it also reinforces cultural practices. I think someone spoke about identity before, and there is a rush sometimes to link the issues that we're discussing today to just purely economic concerns, but it goes beyond economic concerns. There are cultural, spiritual implications to some of these interventions that multinational companies, that state actors make whenever they are interrupting the natural processes of our natural resources. And it's very important for people to understand that, but it's also very important for judicial officers to understand that. And we're seeing a lot of understanding in some of our African jurisdictions, whilst other jurisdictions are a little bit far behind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an example in South Africa where we've been making progress. I don't know if anyone here has heard of the Shah case specifically. No one. Okay, so a little bit of background about the Shah case. There is a place in South Africa, the eastern side of South Africa, called the Eastern Cape, and a coastal community in Gqeberha, specifically, you know it, where Shell was given an exploration right, or rather sold an exploration right by another entity called Impact Africa. When Shell received this right, it had lapsed, and they applied for what is called a renewal right from the relevant department. And when you have these rights, there are certain implications and compliance issues that you have to align with in terms of the various statutes in that jurisdiction: the Environmental Management Act, NEMA, Water Management Act, various other acts that impose on you certain obligations like having public consultations with the communities that are going to be infected by the right that you acquire. And this wasn't done. So what did we do? We spoke to the communities, and we heard directly from them just how important marine life is to them, not just from an economic perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. And this was really key in evidence building in the actual case itself. The court actually referenced evidence from community members and highlighted that it banked its decision on those community voices. And that is I think the strength of, I think there's another speaker who spoke about the fact that the mandate has to come from communities. They have to be involved in all processes, not just whenever decisions are made in order to acquire these rights, but also when they are challenging, when they're pushing back, when they're fighting against, because there's also a tendency for people that intervene to not take up the mantle as if it is their own. The mandate is not ours. We receive the mandate from the clients, who are the community members, and it's important for them to be at the forefront of the fight against some of these transgressions against the environment. And I think that's just the context with which I'd like to speak about those types of interventions. And how has our experience been working with some of these communities? Really great. I think what's important is that there should be a working relationship with communities years before there's some sort of strategy sometimes. Relationship building takes time. Learning about the nuances of different customs and cultures takes time. And I think to just come up on your high horse and think you're going to save the day in a matter of months is a little bit presumptuous. And I think what it really takes is creating platforms for dialogue and information sharing like this one, where you're able to share experiences and have lessons learned. So yeah, that's the context. Thanks, Mercy.
Thanks so much, Norma. And I think really reiterating meaningful involvement and engagement of communities. And I think what you're saying there is, this tokenistic way of engaging communities as an afterthought, or, a group to just sprinkle at the very end, is something that we have to tackle if we are moving forward with climate resilience or even climate action. And I love what you have said, that it's not all gloom and doom. I think there is a strong organizing within the local communities that is happening that we have to appreciate. And so we are really not just speaking about communities as, communities, indigenous peoples, or even coastal communities as groups that really just need to be helped and supported, but we are coming from a place of appreciating the expertise, the immense knowledge that already sits with these communities. And so thinking through how best we can harness this, together towards joint action. So thank you so much for that, Norma. Gabrielle, hearing all this as a policy expert within the small-scale fisheries space, talk to us. What do you make of this? Where are we going wrong? Where should we head? What are we doing right? There are partners in the room here that also would need to, benefit from that. Is there anything we can do different?
Okay. Is it on? Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you so much, Mercy. The benefit of coming last is that you summarize what your colleagues have presented on. Thank you so much for that. Well, while my colleagues were presenting, I was reflecting on some of the experiences that have very interesting ones. First, I'll give you a very short kind of anecdote about what has happened in the area of power. And Mercy, thank you so much for broadening the the understanding of tenure. One day, I think that have been around 2006. I don't know where some of us were here. Okay. We were having a platform such as this to discuss some small-scale fisheries issues in Nairobi. And one lady who was part of our team, we had invited VIPs from the fisheries sector. And in the seating arrangement, this lady was on the far end. This other end, we had the real VIPs. So she left her seat and actually forced herself in between the VIPs. Then people started wondering, what are you doing? She said, power is not given, it is grabbed. Who tells you to occupy the higher seats and relegate us to the periphery? The message about that is that while we talk about power issues, we must also appreciate that we must be assertive. The communities must be assertive. In Kenya, there is a saying that power is not given, power is grabbed. When you are hungry, you don't sit there saying, oh, I'm hungry, please give me food. No. Even if you have a right to food, and you have lawyers here, you must be assertive. So as a group that is working with the small-scale fishers, our express message is that we must be assertive. And being assertive does not mean breaking the law. No. We become assertive within the confines of the laws that provide for our right. Now, the question of tenure and climate issue is very interesting for small-scale fisheries. Very interesting. You know, small-scale fishers are a migratory team. They migrate chasing fish. But now what we know today is that climate change has profound impact on the migration of fish. So you'll find small-scale fishers following fish. How they do it, we have talked about indigenous technical knowledge. They know. Now, within the context of tenure issues, if we have not addressed the tenure issues very clearly, and one express message that we get from this framework called the VGGT, I think Mas knows it. It's a very long word. There are guidelines on tenure issues by FAO, the VGGT. The express message is that if the tenure issues are not clearly defined, there will be conflict. Okay? So where we have a migratory team, fishers, chasing fish, okay? And the fish will end up in spaces where, for instance, because of tenure rights, tenure issues, the tenure systems, they are not supposed, for instance, to be there. What happens? So as we think about climate change and tenure issues, we also have to think about the applicability of MSP, marine spatial planning. If, for instance, you had portions of the ocean, portions of the river, portions of the lake that have been earmarked for, let's say, tourism, okay, that have been allocated for tourism, but the fish migrated to those spaces and the small-scale fishers ended up there, what would happen? How do you address such tenure issues around that? So The point is that the climate change is calling for us to revisit and to think broadly about how to balance between tenure issues and the consequences of the small-scale fishers chasing fish and therefore trying to avoid possible conflicts that could arise. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. And I think, that really focusing on the element of power, and that is a conversation very close to our hearts at Turning Tides. And really not just power, but having partners also shifting philanthropy for partners who are supporting with grants and ensuring that we are beginning to engage and operate as partners, as thought partners, as co-creators, as collaborators, and not donors coming with like a predefined set of what communities need to do or implement, but really thinking the other way around and practically, putting this in action and ensuring that communities are highlighting their own issues. What is of priority to them? What are the gaps? What makes most sense to them if they are supported? That would move them much more closer to tenure security and rights recognition. And I'm saying that in full cognizance of the fact that tenure is also a very complicated, lens and conversation. And so really finding avenues to engage with these partners in ways that make sense to them, in ways that they can understand and appreciate what tenure is, what their lived experience equates to when you speak about rights recognition, and also their space in this conversation. So essentially carving a niche for the communities because they have that space. We are not creating it. They are a critical agent and part of this puzzle. So really bringing them up to the fore, that we are not adding you to this process, but you are actually centric to this process. Indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers, fish workers, and also local communities. So really thank you for articulating the issues around power, which is critical to us. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have listened to my panelists, and I know that we are pressed for time, but we wanted to open up this space a bit for a few reflections, questions, before we are able to close the panel. So, Namadoa, I see you're very eager to take the mic away from me. So, please start us off. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, for that very insightful discussion around tenure and climate change. I also must echo the sentiments of the panelists that through as community, and normally these days I don't like referring ourselves to as small-scale fishers. We are fisher communities. And we go through a lot, especially when it comes to issue of climate change. The number of scenarios where you find that fish and coastal communities are found in the receiving end. And I want to give a good example of the Rift Valley lakes within Africa, where I find that of recent, since 2019 or 2020 thereabout, we've been having the backflow where the rising water levels affects the fish. So I find that by the end of the day, fishers, just as my colleague Gabriel mentioned, that we find chasing fish as far as sometimes even 20 kilometers because it has moved from its natural habitat as a result of the rising water levels. Two, you find that the infrastructure that had been put there, and especially for our women who are actively engaged in post-harvest activities, this particular infrastructure has been submerged. And like in cases of Lake Victoria, Lake Baringo, when you go there, some of these structures are still submerged. What is our government doing to ensure that the fisher communities are one way or the other compensated so that they can be able to proceed with their daily activities without any hindrance? Maybe just to mention so that I give also floor to other colleagues. I have a lot. Thank you so much, Messi and colleagues.
Thank you so much for taking my question. I think my question is related to fishing. I think in today's world we understand that fishing communities are losing their own business. I'm actually from Somalia. I've said that yesterday, and fishing is, I think, one of the, if not the only, primary source of income for local community, for local people along the coastal areas in Somalia, and they're gradually losing uh, this livelihood. So uh, the, they understand that there is something wrong with the system, with the nature, um, but they don't have the tools and the resources to do something about that problem. The government is aware of the impact of climate change on the ocean and on the sea, but Somalia is a long away from doing that. So, is there any advocacy program um, uh, that anyone, like, how can these communities overcome this challenge with limited resources from the government?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Okay. I don't want to listen to the sound of my own voice, so I'm relying on your input. I think the gentleman speaks to a really critical issue that a number of civil society organizations and lawyers have been thinking about, which is how do we ensure accountability, not just from some of these multinational companies for climate change impacts, but from our actual states. And I don't know if everyone knows about what's called an advisory opinion, but there's been these advisory opinion processes happening in other jurisdictions. One was at the International Court of Justice, another one was at the Inter-American Court. And these advisory opinions are supposed to be guidances that are given by apex courts. So you're talking about regional courts in this situation, and not your domestic national courts. And the International Court of Justice is the biggest court in the whole entire world. And they put out what's known as a legal guidance to help people to understand a little bit better some of the legal interpretations that link to certain rights and duties. We have filed a petition at the African Court directly asking the court to answer certain questions about what states' obligations are for climate change impacts that are suffered by African citizens. The situation that you highlight there about these fisher folk that have to now go 20 kilometers finding these fish, that affects certain rights that are protected under the African Charter: the right to life, the right to dignity, socioeconomic standards, health. All of these rights are inculcated in that framework. And what the court has to do is to answer what states' duties are in protecting that specific rights. And some of the things that we're highlighting is also issues of compensation and reparations, not necessarily from your states, because that's a little bit difficult. They're not the ones. We all know Africa is not the highest emitter of any emissions and is the least contributor to the climate crisis. But we know the countries that have been historically emitting high emissions, they have to compensate us. And equally then your states have a duty and obligation to make sure that that compensation finds its way down to your communities and is able to foster some sort of rehabilitative actions and mitigation actions that help in the manner that you are impacted directly by the climate crisis. And so that's what we're pursuing. Currently, the court has actually accepted our petition that's been filed, and now it has opened up a process for states all across Africa to make submissions to respond to the questions that we've highlighted there. One of the questions is compensation. Another question is how just energy transition, how that process is going to work on the continent. Another legal question is how we hold multinational companies and third parties accountable. There are many various questions that we've tabled to it, and so all these states are going to pose submissions to the court, and then what's going to happen is there's going to be a judgment and a finding that helps to clarify some of those obligations and duties.
Thank you, Norma. I wanted to go back to the panel, but in the interest of time, I'll ask you that when I bring you back to just close. But I think something there that you have said that is important that we might need to also echo is we are not saying communities and fisher folk do not have the capacity, but we're only coming on board to reinforce what exists. So it's coming from the known to, as we move to the unknown territories, you would appreciate with me that we are testing approaches together. Sometimes they work, even as a legal, fraternity when we work with communities. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes we really don't understand the issues. And so I think the intentionality here comes from really appreciating that this is collaborative, this is collective, and we need to center the understanding of communities. Sometimes our approaches will not suit them, and so finding ways of stepping back and letting them lead, and then we support. So I really think that needs to come out strongly. Onto your question, my friend from Somalia, and I think they will also respond to it when they close, is there is, of course, a gap still in some of these areas. And I know funding is one issue, because if we look at the percentage of direct funding that goes directly to support, fisher folk and communities, it is still, and particularly around sustainable oceans issues, it is still very minimal. But there is an effort, and I think you can see this is part of the effort to make sure that the issues of the communities are coming to the fore, to also better understand and to better impact how funding flows, and even closely and more directly to communities, to give them the agency to address their tenure-related issues and their related human rights issues. And so thank you for raising that, and it is a space like this where we also pick feedback like that and reflect on it, and we can guarantee you that we hear you and we are with you in this and trying to think through avenues together. The other thing I wanted to say also is there are resources and tools, and I think Norma might have mentioned it earlier, and Glenn, in some of the ways that the communities are organizing, getting support, technical support on legal issues to understand what are our rights, how do we seek accountability when our rights have been violated. Who do we talk to? How do we engage with policymakers? But also just having partners like Turning Tides, OCA, and the other partners in the room, supporting communities to understand, for instance, how do we go about spatial mapping? How do we know our boundaries? How do we understand access? What does access mean? What is tenure security? What is ownership? There are issues in Africa, and where, for instance, women are not allowed to own land. So what happens to women fish traders and processors in their jurisdiction? So how does that affect not just the economic bit, but what has been mentioned by my colleagues, the wholesomeness of tenure, the relationships, the society, power issues. So really thinking about also avenues to identify support like what you're mentioning, and so find avenues to better support. So thank you for raising that. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just see if there's anything pressing, because we are pressed for time. And Honorable Simel has to catch a flight to Goa. And so, can I excuse you, sir? Yes. All right, please. Allow me to excuse him, and then we can just close the panel in a minute. Thank you, sir. So let me just see if there was anything burning. I'm not sure we can take more, but let me just see if there's anything that is really burning that we have to speak to. And this is an ongoing conversation, so this is not the end. So I hope that we can engage, we can continue to speak to each other and continue to think through some of these approaches together. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to just reiterate a few things that I have had in this room as we come to a close. You'd agree with me that climate change and the responses to climate change will impact, whether we think about it or not, the right holders and their tenure rights over and over again, and even more when we speak about shoreline and coastal communities. And so what we need to think about is the interconnectedness of this impact to the tenure security and right recognitions of these groups, as you have heard in this panel today. We cannot run away from the issues of displacement of these communities. like Namadwa was mentioning, when coastal lands and shores become uninhabitable, or when we have coastal erosion and our whole community has to move to an unknown place, the women losing their landing and processing sites. And something critical that was mentioned here also is we cannot shy away from the impacts of the blue economy to these communities, and it's a conversation we must just have. But beyond that, also just thinking about the illegal, unregulated fishing and how this continues to impact, these actors that we are speaking about this morning, who some of them I have the honor to be with me in this panel. But also thinking about climate in its entirety, just how it's impacting, these communities, the extreme weather conditions that we've mentioned, the tropical diseases that come with this that then would mean that some actors are not able to continue with their livelihoods, but also just the change in distribution and abundance of resources that are, is directly an impact of climate. But the other thing that we have to not shy away from is rethinking the approach of centering communities in this conversation and meaningfully. So when we speak about free, prior, informed consent, when we speak about meaningful engagement, how do we bring that to life and not the tokenistic way of engaging with these partners? But also I see potential opportunities. It's not all gloom. That when we look at the loss and damages, we have right holders that have indigenous knowledge, they have expertise, they have heritage that we can use to then better adapt or mitigate some of this, climate impact. And so what I would end by saying is when tenure and rights are overlooked and deliberately ignored, then we can be sure that the well-being, environmental quality, human rights, and opportunities for inclusive economies as stewardship are all impacted. And so, even though we speak about tenure and its security, the interconnectedness, as Norma has mentioned, is something we always have to have lingering in our mind. That it's not just one right, it's a bundle of rights. So when you speak about tenure, there are many other rights that accompany that: the right to life, right to food, right to clean and to a clean and a healthy environment. And so how does it then equate to that? So when you ensure tenure security, you're also addressing the respect and the protection of all these other rights. And in wholesomeness, then addressing the how we can better be resilient towards the climate impact. And so we would end by saying that community-led climate action is only possible when indigenous and fisherfolk are experiencing power and agency, and I think we have said that. And so if they can make decisions on what funding addresses what issues and what decisions are made regarding governance, ownership of their resources, then I think we will be better placed, and we will make sure that tenure continues to be a critical prerequisite to climate resilience, and not just resilience, but climate justice. So on that end, ladies and gentlemen, allow us to end the panel. Thank you.